The amount of pain, suffering, torture, and hope shown in the eyes of Yazidi women kidnapped by ISIS cannot be denied. In 2014, ISIS invaded Yazidi villages on the plains of Iraq. They killed Yazidi men and kidnapped women and young girls. Yazidi women were taken for whatever ISIS wanted. Many of these women endured trauma that they are still trying to recover from. So, when a journalist decides to cover a story, such as the captivity and escape of Yazidi women by ISIS, ethical issues arise. A case study conducted by Johanna Foster and Shirzan Minwala dug into how these brave Yazidi women perceived their media coverage and how it impacted their voice. The study interviewed 26 Yazidi women face-to-face and found that 85% of these women believed journalists treated them unethically when they were asked for and given interviews. The women felt pressure from journalists to share their stories of their times in captivity, forcing them to relive their emotional pain by telling their stories again and again. They also believed journalists put them in harm's way with the news coverage and trusted that journalists would help the Yazidi people gain global recognition to what has happened after sharing their stories. Some of the Yazidi women did want to come forward because they believed it was useful and urgent to do so. However, when a story like this presents itself, journalists have to be able to pursue news coverage ethically. What are the code of ethics that journalists should uphold? According to the Society of Professional Journalists, an ethical journalist acts with integrity and practices 4 principles. In the case of Yazidi women, 2 of these principles will be taken into consideration. The rape, beatings these women went through is highly sensitized material. One principle of the Code of Ethics, minimize harm, addresses this directly.
It's probably because these women they probably don't have much of a voice. These women just probably don't have much of a voice, and people are, especially in those countries where it's very patriarchal, it tends to be very patriarchal. Women are subject to what men want them to do more than we're used to here. So they probably, it probably just took that long for it to trickle down for people to listen.
In the following clip, the interviewer has been talking to these women about the horrific pains they've experienced and asked a question that the reaction alone from these women could explain the ethical issue in this journalism case.
يعني مجبور بودم بکن که گود بانم مچ من مجبور بو هاکت چی گود بانم من مجبور بودم بکن.
این دعوا نامیزش باید کردم.
One of the main mandates or primary mandates for a journalist is to do no harm, just like doctors. When in your practice, if what you're doing, what you're writing or covering is harmful to someone emotionally or physically, psychologically, whatever, then ethically, yeah, there are problems there.
In order to protect themselves and their families, many of the Yazidi women asked not to be shown on camera. Their names were not to be revealed, and the places they currently reside in were not to be acknowledged. The journalists agreed to these terms, and yet Yazidi women still saw themselves on television with everything revealed.
When you are working with a source as a journalist, you have a covenant with that source. You make a covenant with them. You agree to the terms of the interview. And they agreed, and then they broke that. That is deception. It's lying. I mean, it's basic lying. So all these things are contrary to what I'm sure you're all learning in your ethics class about what is acceptable and what isn't. So, total lack of integrity. It is so devastating for these women that this can't be undone. You know, they asked, I don't want you to use my name or my photo or whatever. I would have to respect that. And if my editor, if I got back to whatever newsroom I was working for and my editor said, no, we can't run this story unless we have their names, then I would say, then you can't run the story, because I promised these people, these women, that we wouldn't use their names. So you have to stand by, you know, it's like, are you a person of your word or not?
No one should have to be forced to share, you know, the most excruciatingly painful thing that has ever happened to you. Like, nobody should force you to speak about that, and you should have autonomy over your body and over, you know, what happened to your body, your stories. So I don't see how culture creates an exception. I don't think that it does, you know. Everybody should have the right to their own stories. I mean, in terms of the role that the journalist plays within this cultural context, I think, you know, if you know that somebody is being forced into sharing their stories unwillingly, yeah, then it presents a very unethical situation for you to share someone's story without their full permission and their full consent. In terms of research, right, we have to present our co-participants or our participants of our research with a consent form, and they have to be able to read and understand those consent forms in whatever language that they speak. It needs to be translated, it needs to be understandable, it needs to be in terms that someone can comprehend, and if it doesn't meet that criteria, then you're not doing your job as an ethical researcher. So I think, you know, some same standards certainly do apply. But I think, you know, just talking about excruciating moments just, you know, leaves you so vulnerable and raw, and, you know, to be at that place of vulnerability and rawness, and then to have your face or your name associated with that story is just, you know, it's probably too much to bear. Leaves you susceptible to secondary victimization, right? Like, you as a journalist run the risk of being a secondary perpetrator by exposing these women and their stories, you know, especially if you come from a culture in which, you know, there is a lot of shame. I mean, I think this kind of transcends culture, but that there is a lot of shame attached to the experience that you suffered, you know.
According to the Columbia Journalism Review, it was common among Yazidi women to believe that when they gave up their sensitive information to a journalist, they would be getting help in return. Many Yazidi women questioned the journalists as to why they were taking their voice and not giving anything back. The Women's Media Center said some of the promises were money and aid to help the Yazidi communities rebuild. Even if the journalists believed that their actions would help the Yazidi women, they ultimately made a promise they knew they couldn't honor. The code of ethics provided by the SPJ exists not only to ensure the truth and accuracy of news, but to also respect the well-being and wishes of the sources. The credibility and truthfulness of any news story is dependent on the journalist's sources, and protecting those sources is paramount. Sexual assault is newsworthy and will continuously be covered.
Well, I think it is anytime there's assault, sexual assault, or any kind of assault that's newsworthy. And these men were getting away with it, right? No one was even talking about this. Even if you have to write this, even if the story is written with anonymous sources, then I think it's newsworthy.
How journalists cover these stories and treat the victims during their coverage shows the significance of this ethical dilemma.